Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 17, William Paley's Watchmaker Argument. Our text provides a longer selection from William Paley's Natural Theology than I will present here, but it doesn't seem to complete Paley's analogy as well as this selection does. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed, at some time, and at some place or other, an artificer or artificers, who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it to actually answer, who comprehended its construction, and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design, which existed in the watch, exists in the works of nature, with the difference, on the side of nature, being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Now let's unpack that. First, we need to understand the concept of an argument by analogy. An argument by analogy is an inductive type of argument that takes the similarities of two things as premises to reach a conclusion. The truth of the conclusion will depend on whether the objects being compared are relevantly similar enough to each other for the conclusion to follow. For example, suppose you visit your doctor and your doctor asks if you're attending your annual checkups and physicals. You say you feel fine and you don't think you need to. So your doctor asks, well, you take your car in for service every 3,000 miles and regularly scheduled preventive maintenance, don't you? You say yes, of course, that's my daily driver. It's how I get to work and do everything. If it doesn't get regular checkups and preventive maintenance, it could break down and upset my life. And the doctor replies, exactly, and your body is even more so your daily driver. You may feel fine, but that doesn't mean your check engine light isn't about to come on in the form of pain or illness. If you wait until your body's check engine light comes on, it could indicate that an otherwise treatable smaller problem has developed into an avoidable bigger problem like terminal illness. Just like you need regular checkups and preventive maintenance for your car to ensure that your car doesn't break down and upset your life, your body too needs regular checkups and preventive maintenance to ensure that it doesn't break down and upset your life even more with illness and potentially even death. This argument works by an analogy between your car and your body. These two things are relevantly similar enough to each other that if you accept the logic of the car argument, then you're committed to accepting the logic of the body argument. The direct way to refute an argument by analogy is to show that the objects of discussion are not relevantly similar enough for the conclusion to follow. You could also present an analogy using a more relevantly similar object that has a different conclusion. Or you could provide a different kind of explanation altogether. A more formal schematic might be helpful here to make it clearer. Premise 1. Object A has properties x, y, and z. Premise 2. Object B has properties x, y, and z. Conclusion. Therefore, object B likely also has property w, which is present in object A. Call premise 1 the car argument, where x is it's your daily driver, y is it can break down, and z is a breakdown would upset your life. We can see that w, your car needs regular checkups and preventive maintenance, is entailed by x, y, and z because you don't want your car to break down. Call premise 2 the body argument, where x is, metaphorically, your body is your daily driver, y is it can break down, and z is a breakdown would upset your life. We can see that w, your body needs regular checkups and preventive maintenance, is entailed by x, y, and z because you don't want your body to break down. As you can see, the logic is the same. So if you accept the conclusion of the first argument, you're committed to accepting the conclusion of the second argument. Now that we understand how arguments by analogy work, back to Paley's watchmaker analogy. Paley begins by noting that, while walking through a heath, or whatever piece of uncultivated land, nothing about stones, twigs, or whatever other naturally occurring things specifically jump out at us. We don't wonder to ourselves, who left this rock here? But if we find a watch, we immediately think someone made it and someone must have dropped it there. We might be tempted to object that we have a general understanding of how watches are made and what they're for, so we know it has been made by someone, and that if one ends up on the ground far from any watch shop, then someone must have dropped it when passing through. But this is a superficial reading and objection. Writing this argument off without philosophical consideration doesn't help you or anyone else get closer to truth. We can see that this initial objection fails when we replace the watch with something that meets the criteria Paley set out that lead us to believe that the watch must have been designed, namely, every indication of contrivance and every manifestation of design. These indications of contrivance and design are the organization of the watch, its complexity, and its apparent purpose. It is organized to such a degree that if any of its components were upset, it would cease to function properly. It is so complex that its pieces could not have just fallen into place on accident, and its apparent purpose can be discovered by analyzing its movements in relation to the placement of the sun and the numbers that its hands point to. So, if our general understanding of watches and their manufacturing matters at all for this argument, then the argument shouldn't work with a completely novel object in its place. Consider instead that you find a smooth hexagonal box with straight lines and edges and pulsing lights on each of its 6 sides. We have no idea what it is, and we certainly don't have any general understanding of its origin or function. Yet, we would still think it absurd to suppose it didn't need a certain kind of explanation, as in the case of a stone or some other natural thing. And why is that? Because it meets the criteria set out earlier. Namely, it has the same indications of design as the watch. It has organization, complexity, and apparent purpose. Notice that we were talking about indications of design or contrivance, since we can't actually see design, only indications of design. Snowflakes and other crystalline structures, when analyzed closely, appear to have design, but we certainly don't mean to say that someone gave them their shapes intentionally, which is what the term design means. Designs require designers. So, if you say that something has design, you are saying that someone purposefully constructed it as it is to solve some kind of problem. We design cars, living spaces, and classes and so on, all with goals in mind. We also use the term out of convenience in art, but it's not exactly the same thing. Now, the way the argument is supposed to work is, if it is only on account of these indications of design that we suppose things must have designers, then we're committed to supposing that anything else with these indications, again, organization, complexity, and apparent purpose, must also have a designer. Recall the examples from Aquinas' fifth argument in the last chapter. Bees, though non-rational, are able to serve their purpose of producing honey despite how complicated the process is. They are able to intricately construct hives, even though none of them individually know how to do it, but can collectively construct it as though they had a programmed superordinate mind or software to do so. Plants that are organized, immensely complex cellular structures grow and produce oxygen. Organized and complex systems like the water cycle sustain the plants, which sustain animals, which in turn sustain humans, in a cycle of life that is itself complex, organized, and apparently purposeful. Throughout nature, we see organization, complexity, and apparent purpose from the smallest atom to the largest galaxy, and these are the same indications that lead us to believe that the hexagonal glow box must have been designed, with the difference, according to Paley, on the side of nature being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Since organization, complexity, and purpose are indications of design, there must be a designer. Before closing this lecture, let's briefly cover some common problems that students run into with this argument. The first problem is forgetting that our background knowledge of the watch doesn't matter, as is clearly shown with the hexagonal glow box example. The second problem is getting hung up on the stone. Students will often describe this argument as an analogy between a watch and a stone, when it is actually an analogy between the watch and nature, when nature is understood to be the entire universe. The stone is only used as a point of departure for the argument to show the initial contrast that we see between natural things and objects of design, before we've reflected on them as Paley prompts us to. The third problem also comes from focusing too much on the stone. Students will often claim that since stones have no purpose, the argument fails. However, we can easily use another argument by analogy to show that this is not the case. Consider a sweater or some other piece of clothing. When worn excessively, the lint balls, what some people call pills, that accumulate on the surface do not have a purpose. The fact that seemingly pointless byproducts occur in something is not an indication that it wasn't designed. This is analogous to the stones on the surface of the earth that are byproducts of the tectonic plates that move, rise, and sink due to the convection effect of the molten material beneath the earth's surface. This would be another example of a complex, organized, and apparently purposeful system that demands our positing the existence of a designer if we are to remain consistent. Just like the lint balls on a hoodie are not evidence that the hoodie wasn't designed, neither are rocks on the surface of the earth evidence that the earth wasn't designed. The fourth problem that students often run into is the lack of evidence objection. Students will often claim, without any argument, that Paley has no evidence for his conclusion that the universe was designed. However, this is a misreading of Paley's argument. Paley's evidence is everything. Paley doesn't just have evidence, he has all of the evidence. For Paley, everything that exists serves as evidence for his conclusion. In order to argue against this, we would need to prove that something existed in nature that did not meet the set out criteria, present a better analogy that led to a different conclusion, or come up with a different, more viable explanation altogether. The fifth and final problem we will consider is pointing to another complex, organized, and apparently purposeful system as a competing explanation for Paley's theory. This system, which we have good scientific reason to accept, is evolution by natural selection. However, for anything to be a competing explanation, it must be competing to explain the same thing. But Paley's Watchmaker argument and evolution by natural selection are not two different explanations for the same thing. Evolution explains how species adapt and change over time. Paley is explaining who created all life, the universe, and its systems. So, evolution answers a how question that explains existing life changing, and Paley answers a who question that explains the origin of that life that changes over time. Evolution needs life and birth with minor variation to get started. It does not claim to answer the origin of life itself. Paley is explaining the origin of the life and birth with minor variation that evolution needs to get started. There are other common problems that students run into with this argument, but those are the big five in my experience. Hopefully, it is clear why these ideas are problematic, but if not, we can always discuss it further.